Yeah, cool. So
Yeah,
everybody,
we're up to 60. I think that's good. Alec, whenever you're ready. How about it?
okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you are well wherever you're joining us from, and I want to thank you for choosing to spend your afternoon with us. My name's Alec Willis. I'm the Yale Landscape Lab Fellow and one of your co-hosts for today. I've been working for the YLL for a little over 3 years, and in my time here, I've been fortunate to be a part of many great events. Today, I'm sure we'll be treated to another thought-provoking and stimulating workshop. But more than the events themselves and their contents, it has been the community that the YLL has built that has made my time here so special. As such, I am pleased to see that so many members of that community have chosen to stay engaged with the YLL despite the unusual circumstances in which we find ourselves. We have over 150 persons signed up for this workshop today, and we are so happy to welcome you all. Your other host for today is Dylan Hostor. Dylan grew up in Vermont, but was living in Maine prior to coming to New Haven. He was working as a photographer, a cinematographer, and for North Spore, whose team we'll be hearing from in just a few minutes. Currently, he's studying for his MFA at the Yale School of Art, which he started this past fall, which is also when he joined the YLL team. He serves as the YLL's communications and mycological projects manager, which means he makes sure we have an awesome Instagram account and have awesome mushrooms to post about, among the many other things he does. The YLL is very lucky to have Dylan, and we are grateful for his efforts in coordinating this event. He's going to be running the show today. I think he's going to start by telling us a little bit about North Spore, and then we'll get to learning about some mushroom inoculation. Dylan?
Thanks, Alec. Alec is the fellow at the Yale Landscape Lab and is the bomb, and is also the only person that's been at the farm lately, and making sure that it's working well. Yeah, so I'm a grad student at Yale, which is new for me. I've been there for a year, but before that, I was in Maine, and I was working for North Spore, which is a spawn production facility and a mushroom farm there. And it was a weird beginning, working at North Spore. I answered a really strange and vague Craigslist ad, for a mushroom delivery person. And then I showed up at the facility, and it was sort of like a basement where this guy was growing mushrooms in this tiny little grow tent. And it was so strange, and I didn't know what was going on. And then 3 years later, they became, now, I guess it's like 4 years, they became one of the largest spawn suppliers in the nation. And they're here. The three co-founders are right here. This is Matt on the left. Will you wave, Matt? He's the creative director and one of the co-founders. And in the middle is John, who's the head mycologist. He has a master's in mushroom growing. And Alaya, who just does everything and is one of the coolest people in the world. Yeah, I think I'll just hand it to you guys. I think it'd be best if you guys talk a little bit about the life cycle of a mushroom first, how they grow, and what you guys are doing to support that growth.
Sure. Do you want to start there? You want to do a quick introduction?
Yeah, maybe introduction to North Spore.
Yeah, here's we pulled this out too. This is that's Dylan and the three of us in our first year, a tintype. Thought we'd show that. But yeah, we started in 2014 as a fresh mushroom farm. So we started by actually growing mushrooms and distributing them to mostly to restaurants in the Portland, Maine area. From 2014 to maybe late 2016, early 2017, we kind of expanded the fresh mushroom reach. We were distributing mushrooms throughout the state, down to Boston. We were shipping stuff to New York City and across to the West Coast on a limited basis. And it was about at that time that we started producing mushroom spawn, which is kind of like the seed equivalent for mushroom growers. And since then, we've really pivoted the business. At this point, we are primarily a mushroom spawn producer, and the fresh mushroom production is more kind of an R&D activity for those spawn products. But I'll let John kind of talk about the overall life cycle of mushrooms to give a little bit of context for what we do.
All right. I guess maybe I'll start by just, let's see here. All right, so we've got some mushrooms here. So this is obviously pretty typical. This is an oyster mushroom, so typical mushroom shape. It's got a stem, a cap, and underneath there's gills. And this is the stage of the mushroom life cycle that most people are familiar with. It's what you'll see in the woods, growing on logs, out of the soil. But the stage that we deal with mostly at North Spore, and what people often know less about, is the mycelium. And that's all this white material in the bag. And that is the part of the life cycle that's actually growing in the environment, breaking down woody material, soil, absorbing nutrients, and then ultimately this mycelium will produce the mushroom. And the mushroom is just the reproductive part of the life cycle. So I drew a little schematic of the life cycle behind us that I'll kind of try to talk about just to give you an overall picture of the different stages. So maybe if you bring it up here. Yeah. Okay, this is sort of good. So we've got our typical mushroom up here. And mushrooms will have, some mushrooms have gills, some have teeth, some have pores, but basically they have something on them that's a structure that has a lot of surface area that is producing spores. So the whole point of a mushroom is to generate as many spores as possible. And now those spores, most mushrooms, they're wind dispersed. So the spores drop and they blow around in the environment, right? If a spore lands in a favorable spot, it has enough moisture, it has a food source, it will germinate and start to grow. And what it germinates into is called mycelium or hyphae. So these are a couple spores right here that are starting to germinate into the hyphae or the mycelium. Now, at this stage in the life cycle, each spore actually has only half of the genetic material it needs to produce a mushroom. So it can't reproduce yet. So it has to find the hyphae or the mycelium of another spore in the environment. And then once they meet, the hyphae can fuse together. And now that new fused hyphae or mycelium now has all the genetic material it needs to produce a mushroom. And so when we make spawn, and when we're trying to grow mushrooms, we're always propagating this part of the mycelium. We're not growing from spores, because those have unique genetic makeup, and what you're going to get is going to be variable. But this mycelium right here has everything it needs to produce a mushroom, and we know what genetics we're working with. So this mycelium can grow in the environment. Once it's accumulated enough food, then it will form together and create the fruit body or the mushroom. And again, that mushroom, the whole point is just to make spores. So once those spores are produced, the cycle begins again. And that's just sort of a brief overview, and then we can kind of maybe get into some of the other stuff that we do.
Talk about like the different. So I think most people who start growing mushrooms do so with one of three methods. A lot of people start with kind of doing a simple outdoor method, so they'll make outdoor mushroom beds. So that's kind of the process of taking that mycelium spawn that John was talking about and sprinkling it into a substrate outdoors and allowing the mushrooms to grow, much as like if you planted seeds in a garden bed, how they would grow. Another method would be the log method of growing mushrooms. I think Dylan's going to demonstrate that later, but that's when you take the mushroom mycelium and you actually inject it into freshly cut logs. The mycelium spreads throughout those logs, and when the log is fully colonized with the mycelium, it will then produce the edible mushrooms. And there's also indoor methods for growing mushrooms. So you can grow mushrooms in buckets. So that could be buckets that have holes drilled in them, stuffed with some sort of substrate, often that's straw, mixed with mushroom mycelium, and the mushrooms will grow out from the holes in the buckets. You can grow them in monotubs, which is kind of a similar method to the outdoor beds, but you're actually creating an enclosed space for indoor growing. And then you can also do sort of the more commercial method, where you actually make these humidified and ventilated rooms, and you grow mushrooms from bags. So you colonize the mushroom mycelium in a bag, you slice the bag to expose the mycelium to oxygen, and the mushrooms grow from the bag. But basically what you're trying to do is control a few different variables with mushroom growing. You're controlling temperature, you're controlling air exchange or CO2 levels, and you are controlling humidity and moisture content in the air. And that's kind of what you're kind of balancing all of these three things in order to produce the correct environment for mushroom growing. So we can kind of go over maybe some of the different spawn products, or if you want to go into the culture wars.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just, I don't know if how visible this is, but this is an example of mycelium. So this is the mushroom culture that's growing out on an agar plate. So this is the stage of the life cycle that you don't often get to see. And this is what we use to make the variety of different spawn types that if you were growing mushrooms, you would use to propagate them. So some of those types are, so we have sawdust spawn here. So that's just that culture that's grown out on a sawdust media. So this is just sawdust in here, and then it has that mushroom mycelium growing on it. This is often used for inoculating logs outside. And there's a variety of different methods of doing log growing that would utilize sawdust spawn, which Dylan's going to talk about. And then we also have grain spawn, which is the same thing. It's that mycelium grown on grain in this instance. And this is often used by indoor commercial growers, but then more and more by outdoor growers as well. So you can use this to spawn outdoor beds, whether you're growing on straw, wood chips, manure for manure-loving species. Matt's even just sprinkled this straight into his garden bed right in the soil and had mushrooms popping out of it. So there's a lot you can do with this, and once they get established, mushrooms are pretty easy to grow and very vigorous.
So the other thing that North Spore does, and it's kind of part of its culture and business, is we actually are almost like a seed bank for mushrooms. So one of the unique parts of the mushroom biology is you can take a fruiting mushroom from the wild or from another grower, and you can bring it into a laboratory setting, and you can revert that mushroom back into its mycelial stage and get it onto a petri dish like the one that John was showing. So we actually collect these. We have about 200 different cultures of edible mushrooms, wild specimens, things that were unique that were found in the wild, and we keep all of those in in a deep freezer so that we can maintain those genetics, do experiments with cultivation, and provide a resource to the greater mushroom growing community. So when they want to do experiments or try different cultivation techniques, there's a resource for those materials. Yeah, I mean that's basically our brief overview. There's I think we can maybe answer any brief questions on that, or move to the log demo, or what do you think, Dylan? We could also do a tour of North Spore if you want to do that now.
Yeah, will you do the tour real quick, and then
yeah. It's going to be a little bit loud, but we'll try to give you a brief walkthrough. All right. You talk and all
that. So this is our packing area up here. So this is kind of where we ship out all of the variety of products that we produce. So this is one walk-in that we have, and this is all grain spawn in here. So this is where we store the grain spawn before we ship it, and it needs to be refrigerated. So spawn will last for several months unrefrigerated, but this just slows down the metabolism and means we can keep it longer. So this is our lab in here with all of the people not wanting to be filmed running away. But so this is where we do all of the culture work.
Can we go in?
Yeah, we can go in.
Yeah, good.
So at this stage of the process, this is where we need to control the conditions the most because we're trying to create the ideal environments to propagate our cultures. At the same time, though, we're dealing with the fact that all the air around us all the time has tons of mold and other fungal spores that also want to grow on that material. So one of the big things with growing mushrooms is you have to prevent contaminants from growing, but also propagate what you're trying to grow. And when you're doing outdoor grows, that's not nearly as difficult, but when we're producing spawn, it's very critical that we're only growing the strain that we're trying to grow. So right here, this is Kate. She's working in our flow hood. And this is just a piece of equipment that allows you to work in it, but in filtered air. So it allows us to just propagate the cultures that we're trying to propagate. Yeah. So here is one fridge in which we're storing all of these cultures. So these are all, each one is a different strain, different species in certain instances. And this is the kind of how we grow them out on these plates right before we use them to create spawn. I can also show you where we do store the cultures, which is a little bit more controlled than this fridge. So this is our deep freezer, and we store all of our cultures in this. And the advantage of this is we can actually store these cultures up to 5-10 years before ever having to grow them out. So they're really dormant in here, and it also, we're probably using, I don't know, maybe 1/10 of its capacity. So we have the potential to be storing thousands of different strains in this deep freezer, which, you know, we're at a couple hundred right now, but we're building that up as we go. And this is one of our incubation rooms. So this is grain spawn that we have in here. It's just growing. We've already inoculated it, so you can see at different stages. So some of the bags, like this one here, we just inoculated. They haven't grown out at all. And then some of these other ones are almost getting fully colonized. And, you know, a few more days, that would be ready to send out. And then I'm not sure. Is there anything in there, Kate? Is there a rack in there or anything? So this is just another space that we have where we can control the environment, and we produce grain spawn in here, sawdust spawn, plug spawn. It's kind of just built to be a little bit more of a production laboratory, so we can do the same kind of sterile culture work we were doing in the flow hood I just showed you, but we can do it at a larger scale. So in this room, we have a giant autoclave here, and this is for us to process several hundred bags every single run. And then we pull those out into this room. This is a rack of those bags cooling, and then ultimately we'll inoculate them with the mushroom culture in another flow hood over here.
Okay, get our shoes back on, sorry. We'll do that.
So this is another clean room that we have. That's Kyle in there. He's sanitizing it right now. But this is a space that we use to inoculate sawdust spawn, or sawdust that's going to go into fruit at home kits, or whenever we're trying to grow mushrooms. So this environment, because we're not producing grain spawn or doing the culture work in, it doesn't need to be quite as sterile. We still have positive air pressure, and do various things to keep it really clean. But it's as we get kind of further along in the mushroom growing process, the constraints get easier and easier to deal with. And as you'll see, when Dylan's doing his stuff, he's doing it outside in open air. You know, he doesn't really have to worry about mold spores around him. And in this instance, we're still concerned about that, but not nearly as much as when we're doing the culture work. All right, so this is one of our mixers here. So we basically just use this to hydrate and blend the substrates that we're going to inoculate. So we mostly use this for our sterile substrate line, and then also for producing all of the sawdust substrates that go into our fruit at home kits or sawdust spawn. And one way that we actually grow mushrooms on sawdust on a commercial scale that's pretty neat is by using steam sterilization. So we use, are they looking at it? Or? So we have these tanks that basically this is just a giant stock tank that we are piping steam into. So it doesn't build any pressure, but the steam allows us to heat the bags to 180, 200 degrees, which is enough to just sort of pasteurize them, to make the environment in the bag or in the sawdust favorable to the species we're trying to grow and unfavorable to any mold species. So this is kind of a, people can do this on a pretty small scale on a farm or on a more commercial scale, and it's pretty easy and low barrier to entry, but on a larger scale than probably most home growers are gonna try to do.
Talk about this one?
Oh, sure. This is another mixer. It's a larger one. It's stainless steel, which we use to hydrate, heat, and mix and bag the grain spawn that we produce. So it's like the other red mixer. There's a bagging machine on the bottom, and it fills with water, heats, and mixes millet. And then we can drain it and dispense it into bags. And then it will go on the autoclave racks and into the autoclave to get sterilized before it gets inoculated in the flow hood with whatever species of mushroom we want to be growing. Here's an empty rack. So the bags would go on there and then into the autoclave.
Then incubating bags.
And this is all incubation for more spawn and grow kits that are growing before they need to be cooled and shipped out or used in-house.
That's pretty much a brief tour. We also have a mushroom growing space down the hall, but we actually don't have internet access down there. In the rooms we've shut down temporarily because our restaurant accounts don't need mushrooms right now, so we're kind of focusing on spawn. But yeah, we'll go back up to the office, and maybe Dylan can do his outdoor log inoculation, and we can kind of narrate what he's up to.
Thanks, guys. I think it would also be helpful if you explained what a grow at home kit is.
Yeah. Like you're talking about the indoor kits?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's large scale commercial mushroom farms will sterilize sawdust and inoculate that sawdust with mushroom spawn, and then use those bags in grow rooms to produce edible mushrooms. We produce a kind of small scale version of that. It's got a few of them. They're essentially kits that you would just pop open the front of the kit, slice the bag that's underneath the panel here. The mushroom sense oxygen in the air, and it'll actually start kind of growing right from, imagine this inside of that box. That's essentially what that is right there. And all of this it's actually sawdust. At one point it was loose sawdust. Now it's a really hard kind of brick of white mycelium that's consuming that sawdust, and then the mushrooms themselves are the fruiting bodies of that are growing out from a slice in this bag. So a lot of people who start growing mushrooms will be kind of introduced to concepts through a grow-at-home kit. So you can grow it on your kitchen counter or anywhere at home, and it's kind of like a fail-safe introductory way to try growing mushrooms.
Yeah, for sure. I'll talk a little bit about what I have going on here, which is I bought some spawn from North Spore, some oyster millet spawn. And then I hot water pasteurized some wood chips that I just happened to find on the side of the road. And they were fresh enough that I didn't have to super pasteurize them. So I just used hot water from the tap. And then pretty much lasagnaed like a couple inches of wood chips and then a crumbled layer of millet spawn. And I kept going all the way up and just kind of let this be for about a month. And now it's fruiting and pretty much ready to pick. They're drying out a little bit because it's so hot and windy out. And then I just feel like I have to reiterate the importance of sterility because it's kind of amazing what you guys have done and at what size you're able to make so much sterile. This is my personal just attempt at making spawn. This is one of 5 half-gallon jars that worked. All the rest have this, which is green mold, which is what happens when you don't have a sterile environment. Yeah. Another super easy way to grow mushrooms is in logs. I can't bring my computer outside because it's a little too windy. So Matt and Laya and John, if you guys could just explain what I'm doing, I'm going to turn my microphone off.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, so Dylan has sections of freshly cut hardwood. Freshly cut's really important in this process. A lot of people think that mushrooms, when they see mushrooms in the wild, they're growing on rotting logs. The logs already have mushrooms sprouting off them, but they're actually rotting because there's mushroom mycelium decomposing them. So what you want is a blank slate. You want a freshly cut log that doesn't have any mushroom mycelium growing in it yet. There's a number of species that work with particular species of mushrooms, and you kind of have to pair the correct species of tree with the correct species of mushroom. I think Dylan today is doing shiitake, and shiitake is a really great species to begin with, especially for doing outdoor logs. It's a bit of a trickier species to grow indoors, but a very fail-safe way to do outdoor mushroom logs. So Dylan is going to drill holes around the entire circumference of this log. Usually people take 4-foot sections of log, usually 3 to 5 inches in diameter. The larger the log, the slower the process will be of the mushroom mycelium growing throughout it. So there's kind of a sweet spot, and that tends to be it right there. So he's just doing holes along the whole length of that log. They're about 5 inches apart, and then you're going to kind of do a diamond pattern around the whole circumference. There are particular size drill bits for particular types of spawn. So what North Spore produces, we produce plug spawn, which is actually just wooden dowels that people use for furniture making that have been inoculated with mushroom mycelium. So that you can either buy those and put them in by hand and use a hammer to plug the log, or you can use a loose form of sawdust like Dylan is using here, which is loose sawdust that has mushroom mycelium in it, and you're going to end up having to use an inoculator tool, which he's picking up right there. See, it's basically a hollow tube with a plunger mechanism, and you're going to shove the spawn into it and then inject it into the logs. There are some benefits and drawbacks for both plug spawn and sawdust spawn. Sawdust spawn, you obviously need to invest in tools to do the process, but the plug spawn is it's easier. You do it by hand, but it tends to be more expensive and a little bit slower to colonize. Yeah, so you can see Dylan shoves the inoculator into the bag, and then it discharges a plug of sawdust with mycelium. And so you essentially just inject that spawn into every hole that you've just drilled. One of these bags of spawn does about 20 logs this size, so I don't think Dylan's gonna do all 20 right now, but you do want to use all the spawn when you open a bag of spawn. It's best practice to use it as soon as possible. It's a product that is essentially just that mushroom species. When you open it up to the air, other spores that are floating in the air can then contaminate it and make it less viable over time.
So here, I just have sort of a crock pot. It's full of cheese wax that I've melted. I'm just gonna. What's that?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm gonna cap each hole so moisture doesn't come out of that hole.
Yeah, so cheese wax is a food grade paraffin. You can use beeswax. Sometimes if the wax is too brittle, you can add a little bit of mineral oil to thin it out. The wax that we use is granulated. It's like a granulated food grade paraffin. But yeah, really any type of food grade wax is fine to use.
And usually I would go all around the entire log, but I'm not going to do that now just because it's kind of dull. Yeah, this is one of my favorite ways to grow mushrooms. They last a really long time. A good rule of thumb, this is maybe like a 5-inch diameter piece of wood. A good rule of thumb is every inch is about a year's worth of growth. So this will probably fruit for 5 years. It does take about a year for the mycelium to find itself and make that hyphae throughout the whole log. But once it does, it's going to start fruiting. So this will probably start fruiting next fall. And I'm going to run around the side of the house here and show you a wine cap bed. If you guys could explain what that is.
Yeah, so wine cap is a species that you can't grow in logs. It doesn't do well in logs, but you can incorporate it into a garden bed or a wood chip bed outdoors. So you want to find kind of a shadier part of your property and mix that wine cap sawdust spawn into wood chips or straw. Make sure that it stays, it has some moisture in it and is, sees some rainfall periodically. But you'll actually get these beautiful giant, what they call king stropharia or wine cap mushrooms that will pop out from your bed. And they tend to grow really fast. They'll actually start producing usually within the same season that you inoculate, and come back year after year, and oftentimes will establish themselves on your property. So you'll have wine caps year after year. Sometimes you'll have to feed your bed periodically, so add fresh wood chips or straw to make sure that there's a constant food source.
Yeah, so I'm in southern Vermont. I'm quarantined with my family, or at my family's house, who are on my screen. Hey guys. So here, this is my mom, like a flower bed that my mom has going on, and I just put a like 2 by 4 foot bed of wood chips down. I did this about a month ago, and I again lasagnaed that. So a layer of wood chips, a layer of Stropharia spawn, layer of wood chips, kept going up. There's actually no straw in this. I just put straw on the top about a week ago to try and keep some moisture in. I'm gonna take that off pretty soon. I don't know if y'all can see this, but there is some like pretty amazing mycelium growth. Can you see it at all?
It's hard.
Yeah, I promise it's there.
Yeah, the mycelium for wine cap's really visible. It looks like these beautiful, like pure white branching, pattern that goes through your substrate. And it's actually a good way to see if your bed is taken or not. Is just to peel back a little bit of the top layer and just see if you see that branching white mycelium.
Yeah. And then also while I'm here, these are some chestnut mushroom logs. I've never grown chestnuts, but I'm gonna try letting these be for about a year, and then next spring I'm gonna bury them, and they might fruit.
Yeah, so there are certain species that, I mean, I talked about how shiitake is a very easy mushroom to grow on logs. There are species that are a little bit more involved and require some extra care. So there are certain species that do best when you actually steam sterilize or cook your log segments and inoculate them before actually letting them colonize and then burying them outdoors. Those species are, the hen of the woods, the chicken of the woods, the reishi mushrooms. There's a number that are a little bit more involved, but yeah, the shiitakes tend to be a very easy one that doesn't require that extra work. Anything in the oyster genus, so the golden oysters, the Italian oysters, the blue oysters. And then there are certain species that do well on logs using the totem method, which I think Dylan also has a totem to show you. That's the process of taking log segments and sandwiching the spawn instead of injecting it. So you would take a wider section of log and you would take, that sawdust spawn and then put a layer of it between each section. The mycelium will then grow into each section of the log and will fruit mushrooms after it's fully colonized. So best practices with this method, most people actually do this in a contractor bag. So they'll sandwich the sections of spawn between the sections of wood, and then they'll tie a contractor bag up around it to maintain a humid environment for that mycelium to grow throughout the log. You still have a decent colonization period. It kind of depends on the species. Certain species will colonize faster than others. But then those totems can live outdoors and will produce mushrooms for multiple years as well. So that method actually works particularly well with the oyster species and lion's mane mushrooms. Lion's mane are kind of a really cool culinary mushroom that is also a medicinal mushroom. It's very popular right now in kind of the wellness group for helping with cognition. So there's some research being done on its role in neuron regeneration and Alzheimer's and dementia prevention. That's kind of exciting. And it's also a really tasty edible.
Yeah.
So I feel like we have some questions. I don't know, do you want to maybe moderate some
Hey,
questions?
Dylan, do you mind just giving everybody talking a little bit about some of the work we did in the fall and the mushrooms that we have growing out at the farm now?
Last fall, I inoculated 2 beds of Strophoria, the wine cap mushrooms. They're already fruiting, right?
Yeah. I actually just saw them this morning when I was out there watering. They look beautiful.
Missed them. Yeah, so those colonized the entire bed last winter, which is pretty amazing. And then I also inoculated a bed of turkey tail mushrooms, which are a non-edible but medicinal mushroom, and a shiitake bed too, I think, and an oyster bed. I did a bunch of beds.
Yeah, you did. We did that entire front row by the front gate of the farm. So yeah, once everybody's able to come back out to the landscape lab, you'll be able to see some of the work that Dylan's been doing for us.
For sure. There's also a lot of herbs growing in those beds, which is nice just because the plants are releasing CO2 and the mushrooms are like people and take in oxygen. Other way around. The plants are releasing oxygen and taking in CO2, and mushrooms are like people, and so it's really symbiotic. This was originally planned to be an in-person workshop, and we still have some vague plans that once it's safe to do that, maybe next year, just so y'all know, it'll happen. All right, we have so many questions. Ready? All right. So someone said that they're looking for recommendations to maintain humidity after mushrooms have fruited.
So I guess it would depend on what
Indoor
or outdoor, but we could probably talk to both. So I guess for outdoor growing, the best practice is to keep your logs or your bed someplace that is perennially shady. So that could be like a north-facing side of a house. It could be in the woods, but you want to pay attention to whether the trees are deciduous and are going to drop their leaves, and all that, shady area in the summer becomes really bright and sunny in the winter. You kind of want to find something perennially shady, so something under evergreen. That helps maintain the moisture in the logs and the beds.
Also, if you have any natural water features on a property, like a stream or a pond, both, it's just going to be more humid around those, so it's a good place to put logs, especially, I mean, you'd also want that to be in the shade, because the sun will dry them out even next to water. But then you can also, if your logs, say we haven't gotten rain for a few weeks or a month or more, you can always take those logs and dump them in the stream or the pond as a way to hydrate them, and even that can even stimulate them to produce mushrooms. So if you have that, you should definitely use it.
In indoor settings, so if you're doing one of those little grow-at-home kits, we recommend putting it by a kitchen sink, someplace that has a little bit of ambient humidity. If you are in a particularly dry environment, you could always make kind of like a terrarium out of a plastic bag or some sort of dome that has to have plenty of airflow, because those mushrooms exhale CO2 and inhale oxygen, and if you make it too tight, they'll actually suffocate themselves and won't be able to grow. But as long as there is some air exchange, and you can spray the inside of that terrarium or bag, kind of create a little microclimate. On a larger scale, like in our grow rooms, maybe Eli, do you want to talk about how we manage humidity?
Sure. So you really want it to be as kind of like a fog, the moisture, or really be moisture absorbed into the air. So there's different types of humidity systems. For a really small grow room, like a home grow room, you could use ultrasonic ceramic disc. They're kind of like pond fogger humidifiers, which produce a really fine fog and work pretty well, but they're pretty temperamental and need to be cleaned a lot, but they're cheap. There's another pretty portable unit that we've used called hydrofogger, which has a float valve, and you can have plumbed in and will independently produce fog. And then what we have now is a system called AeroMist, which is a higher pressure system with a lot of nozzles along it, which produces a very fine mist to humidify larger rooms.
And I'd say, so one key thing that Elias kind of getting at there is, especially when the mushrooms have started fruiting, you don't want to really drench them, right? So you want the air around them to be humid so that they're not drying out, but you don't want droplets of water or, to hose them down, because they will absorb that water, and it can reduce the quality of the mushroom. When they're very young, that's not as big of a deal, but as they get bigger, that heavy drenching. So if you're growing shiitake on logs and they're pretty mature, if you know it's going to rain, it might be good to pick those before you get a really heavy rain, because if it does rain, they'll be super soggy and they won't last long at all.
Yeah, totally. We have a bunch of questions. So,
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I took some time.
what agar do you use?
What?
What type of agar do you use?
So we use malt extract agar and potato dextrose agar. Basically, what's sort of best practice with agar is actually to change it up. So if you've done a couple transfers on one type of agar, say like MEA, which would be malt extract, do your third on PDA. So you're doing things so that the mycelium is constantly experiencing a new substrate, and that way it keeps producing the enzymes that it needs to break down those novel things. It kind of maintains the vigor of the strain by stressing it continually with new things and complex substrates.
Any recommended intro readings about mycology?
Trying to think.
Medical mycology.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple books that we often recommend. I feel like there's still room for like a really good book on mycology, or something that makes it very accessible. But some good books. There's Ken Mudge and Steve Gabriel. They're from Cornell University, and they did a research study on commercial growing of shiitake in woodlands. They have a book called Farming the Woods. It also goes into farming plants commercially, but talks a lot about mushrooms. There's a book by Trad Cotter called Organic Mushroom Cultivation and Microremediation. That's also a good one. It's kind of a lot of introductory outdoor mushroom growing techniques and goes into some laboratory work and some indoor techniques as well.
One that I really like, that it's not growing based, but it's a really good introduction to the fungal kingdom. It includes kind of like edible mushrooms and then just all the kind of obscure fungi with neat, interesting ecologies, is Magical Mushrooms, Mischievous Molds. So that's a good one if you want just sort of a broad introduction to the field of mycology that's fun and light to read.
John, I'm waiting for that book that you're gonna write.
Yeah, I know, we gotta get on it.
Do most mushroom species have the same CO2 temperature and humidity requirements, or do they differ greatly?
I would say that it's similar, but there's definitely differences.
And there's some outliers too.
Yeah.
So a lot of the ones that we've produced in the past, so anything in the oyster varieties, lion's mane, shiitake, namakos, chestnut mushrooms, they all kind of have a pretty similar range. I'd say like around 55 degrees to 70 degrees. Humidity, like 85% or...
Right, so I would say out of all of them, the humidity is fairly constant. So that's something that, especially when the mushrooms are just starting to pin, a really high humid environment is helpful, like 90, 95. As the mushrooms are developing, something a little bit lower, like 85 is really ideal. But then with heat and with CO2, that can vary a lot more. So there's certain mushrooms that do really well in cold temperatures, like hen of the woods, or we have a snow oyster strain that really prefers cold temperatures. And then there's certain mushrooms that do really good in warm environments. So like the almond agaricus, paddy straw mushroom, some of the tropical oysters like the pink oyster, golden oyster. And then CO2 tolerance varies a lot too. So we can have rooms that have very little air exchange and certain mushrooms will grow fine and others won't fruit at all. They'll sense there's not enough oxygen, they'll never even produce a fruit body. So that can vary quite a bit as well.
What's the easiest way to grow mushrooms as a beginner?
So I would say the easiest way would be to do an indoor grow kit. That's like there's sort of a set amount of food. They're gonna produce a few rounds of mushrooms and then they're gonna be done. If you want something a little bit more involved but still really easy, you could do a wine cap bed outdoors. That would be taking a bag of wine cap sawdust spawn, sprinkling it into wood chips or straw, someplace shady, making sure it has good moisture retention. And those will grow within the same year. And then I would say if you want a little bit more advanced than that, you could go into the shiitake logs outdoors, or doing a monotub using kind of like a bulk substrate mixed with grain spawn indoors. But I would say a indoor grow kit is usually where most people start with the process.
And I would just say the nice thing with our grow kits, we actually guarantee the first fruiting. So we try to make it as easy for people to get started as possible. And that's a great way to just like try it out, get used to the life cycle, get used to the fruiting process, and then kind of work your way up to actually inoculating your own substrates and kind of taking on more of the life cycle that you're propagating and managing.
Sweet. If someone bought spawn from you, what's the best way that they should keep it?
So most spawn you want to keep refrigerated. It basically goes into dormancy when it's refrigerated. So having it outside of refrigeration will cause it to continue to kind of consume its substrate And eventually what it will do is actually start producing mushrooms in the bag. So you'll just have like a bag of spawn with a few mushrooms on it. It doesn't tend to hurt it all too much, but isn't really the best practice. So usually you want to get spawn fresh. You want to use it quickly. That's the best case scenario. But if you need to, you can stick it in the fridge and it will last for usually up to a couple of months. Sometimes more, depending on the strain and the spawn variety.
Are the grow at home kits safe to have around pets?
Yeah, I've never heard of anyone having an issue with pets. They might be interested in it a little bit at first, but they also grow really fast, so they're not sticking around too long. The mushrooms, when they start to pin, it'll only take 4 or 5 days for them to be harvestable. So, yeah, we haven't had much feedback about pets being an issue, and they're certainly not going to hurt a pet should they consume it.
Where should you keep logs after inoculating them?
Someplace shady, so someplace where they're not going to get a lot of direct sunlight and not dry out, but also someplace where you're not going to forget about them. You want to kind of keep an eye on them, make sure that if there is a prolonged drought, that you would soak those logs overnight just to get some moisture back into them.
Yeah, and I'd say to Matt's point, a place where you are going to see them and check them out more frequently, because we talk to a lot of customers that will be like, oh yeah, we inoculated, we didn't have any mushrooms, for a while, and then we went out there and there were mushrooms everywhere, but they were gone. So once they fruit, it's a very short window. It's like maybe 5 days, 7 days at most. So when it's the right time of year, you kind of just have to be checking them.
Yeah. Someone, I think Alec asked me what I used to sterilize these jars. I didn't. That's why there's so much contamination. Oh, someone asked how many mushrooms they can expect from a bag of spawn and how much from a bag or a fruit at home kit.
So one of those bags of sawdust spawn, like the one that's sitting behind Dylan right now, that does about 20 logs, 20 shiitake logs. Each one of those logs could be expected to produce 1 to 2 pounds of mushrooms every year over the course of a 5 to 6 year period. So it's quite a bit of mushrooms from that one bag of spawn. A bag of spawn costs about the same amount as a grow at home kit. A grow at home kit is more of a, it's more about the experience, the introductory nature of it. It's not really a means of producing mushrooms in a cost-effective way, but it can produce multiple pounds, usually somewhere between 1 to 4 over the whole life of that substrate.
And just to put that in perspective, so it's 1 to 4 versus adding up what Matt just described is more like 200 pounds potentially from like a sawdust bag on logs. So you get a lot more mushrooms for your money with buying sawdust, but there's a lot more work involved, waiting time, and the beginner kits are really just that. They're for introducing you to the experience.
And you can kind of, it makes sense, right? Like the mushrooms are consuming the wood of the log, and they're consuming the sawdust in that bag, and that just the scale of that and the difference between 20 4-foot logs to one 4-pound bag of sawdust is very different.
I mean, I think that's good. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for watching.
Yeah, it was
I'd also just say, if you want to check out, we're trying to produce more educational content. Where I think Dylan recommended watching some of the videos on YouTube, but we're constantly updating it and trying to, learn, experiment, get some new growing methods out there. We have a blog on the website that kind of goes over a lot of that stuff too. And yeah, we just stay in touch, join our email list, try growing mushrooms.
Yeah. And reach out if you have any questions.
Yeah,
we're here to help.
Absolutely. Yeah. And come visit the Yale Landscape Lab when it's possible.
Yeah, definitely.
It's
sorry we had to do this presentation wearing face masks. I'm sure that wasn't.
No, you did an excellent job. The sound quality was actually pretty good throughout.
Oh, good.
I'm gonna put a link to the grow kits in the chat, just so y'all can look at those. They're pretty amazing.
Awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. So lovely to see y'all.
Thanks, Dylan. Good to see you.
All right. Bye, everyone.